They laughed when Keanu Reeves walked into court with a notebook until he exposed the truth that could ruin billionaires. Sued for $600 million, 0 cents, and mocked by the most arrogant lawyer in America, he stayed silent. Until the moment that changed everything. What was he really writing, and why did it leave the courtroom speechless? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The courtroom was already half full when Keanu Reeves walked through the polished wooden doors of Los Angeles Superior Court. Cameras clicked quietly from the gallery. Some journalists had been camped outside since sunrise, hoping to catch a photo of the trial's most unlikely defendant. No one expected him to show up alone, but there he was, dressed in a simple charcoal gray suit. His black tie modest, shoes shined but unflashy. No entourage, no spectacle. Just calm, steady steps down the center aisle. At the plaintiff's table, Victor Langford stood with the posture of a man used to commanding attention. He turned his head just enough to see Keanu approach and chuckled under his breath. Langford was everything Keanu wasn't. Flashy, theatrical, armed with a phalanx of assistants and a media machine built to intimidate. He wore a deep navy pinstripe, his gold cufflinks gleaming under the lights, and his smirk radiated confidence. Keanu said nothing. He slid into the defendant's seat and placed a single item on the table in front of him. A worn, leather-bound notebook. He opened it carefully and looked down, not to write, but to read something already written. He turned a page, then another. His expression never changed. Langford leaned toward the jury box as he whispered just loud enough for the room to hear, "Well, this won't take long." The jurors exchanged awkward glances. A few reporters in the gallery stifled a laugh. The court officer called out the start of proceedings, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Serena Klein." The room stood. The judge entered briskly, adjusting her robes and scanning the courtroom with the sharp, perceptive gaze of someone who had seen too many cases built on arrogance and too few on truth. She sat, the courtroom followed. Keanu remained composed, hands folded, the notebook still open in front of him. Judge Klein tapped the bench once with her pen. "We are here today for opening arguments in the matter of Orentech Incorporated versus Mr. Keanu Reeves, civil charges of intellectual property breach and violation of non-disclosure under California Statute 5122. Plaintiff may proceed." Langford rose with slow, theatrical precision, straightening his silk tie and buttoning his jacket like a magician preparing his first trick. He turned to the jury and offered them a smile he had practiced 1,000 times in the mirror. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've probably heard the name Keanu Reeves, movie star, philosopher of cool, the face of 1,000 memes." Some jurors chuckled. Langford let the laughter breathe for a moment before continuing. "But today," he said, pacing toward the rail, "you'll hear about a different Keanu Reeves. A man who believed that fame gave him the right to break the rules. A man who inserted himself into a world he didn't understand, took credit for technology he didn't build, and now finds himself facing the consequences." He turned and pointed toward Keanu. "And he came here today with nothing but a notebook." Langford's voice dropped, dripping with mock concern as he addressed the jury again. "I don't blame him," he said, gesturing casually toward Keanu. "It must be disorienting for someone who's lived in movie scripts and stunt choreography to walk into a courtroom where facts matter, where evidence matters." He let the silence stretch, letting the implication hang in the air like a smoke trail. Then he pivoted. "This is not about celebrity. This is not about image. This is about the law. It's about intellectual property theft, real theft. Orentech, the company I represent, spent over 8 years and $200 million developing a proprietary solar microgrid system that could change how the world receives power. And what did Mr. Reeves do?" Langford turned and made eye contact with the jury. "And funded a community tech center. He smiled for some cameras. Then, without permission or qualification, he claimed co-ownership of something he didn't create, and when Orantech defended itself, he claimed victimhood. Langford spun on his heel and gestured toward the courtroom walls, his voice now booming with theatricality. Let's be clear. This case is not a morality play about a misunderstood hero. This is a simple matter of legal boundaries. Mr. Reeves violated a non-disclosure agreement. He interfered with proprietary development. And he attempted to profit, yes, profit, from the unauthorized use of our intellectual property. He held up a printed contract, waving it slightly. This, he said, is the agreement he signed. This is what he broke. Keanu didn't move. He didn't blink. His eyes remained lowered toward the open notebook. Langford smirked. You'll notice, Your Honor, that Mr. Reeves has no legal team with him today, no seasoned trial attorney, no expert witnesses, just himself, and a young assistant, Olivia Tran, who was a paralegal 6 months ago. The camera flashes flickered. Olivia's face flushed. She sat straight, her notes perfectly aligned, but her hand trembled slightly. Keanu reached over and tapped his index finger lightly on the edge of the table. She nodded once and steadied her breathing. Langford shrugged at the jury with a grin. Folks, we'll be respectful, of course, but let's be honest. This will be over by lunchtime. Judge Klein raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Langford returned to his table, satisfied. The room buzzed with a quiet murmur. The confidence was contagious. Reporters began typing. The jurors leaned back in their chairs. Judge Klein turned toward the defense table. Mr. Reeves, do you wish to make an opening statement? Keanu gently closed his notebook, not with haste, but with a reverence that made Olivia glance sideways. Then he stood slowly, adjusted his suit jacket, walked forward with no notes, no slideshow, no legal theatrics. He placed both hands on the rail, looked up, directly into the eyes of the jury, and then he said, absolutely nothing. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Just silence. One juror shifted uncomfortably, another cleared his throat. The courtroom grew taut with unease. Even Langford blinked twice, confused by the silence. Then Keanu spoke, softly, calm, controlled. Some truths don't need to shout. He paused. Not for drama, but for breath, for weight. I won't waste your time pretending to be what I'm not. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a team of 10 behind me. I don't have color-coded folders or exhibits stacked 5 feet tall. I have a notebook. He held it up, the leather cover worn smooth by years of use. This notebook, he continued, contains pages of sketches, formulas, meeting notes, diagrams, and, yes, mistakes. Not perfect ones, real ones. Built during long nights with engineers. Shared over cheap coffee and broken circuits. Scribbled on during storms when the power went out and we needed a better answer. Keanu turned a few pages and laid the notebook gently on the rail, open to a hand-drawn schematic. This system we created wasn't meant to make money. It was meant to help. To give power, literal power, to neighborhoods left behind, to elders whose fridges shut off during heat waves, to children trying to study under flickering lights. He met the jury's eyes now, one by one, and yes, I helped build it. Langford scoffed audibly, but Keanu didn't look away. Not because I needed credit, not because I wanted headlines, but because I believe you don't need to be an engineer to contribute to engineering. You need vision, patience, curiosity, and above all, collaboration. He closed the notebook again, slowly. The plaintiff will present contracts, timelines, maybe even a few clips of me in a tool belt, and they'll say that makes me a thief. He looked over at Langford, then back to the jury. But what if the evidence says something different? What if, over the next few days, you see proof that I wasn't just involved, but foundational? What if the truth doesn't roar, but waits? He stepped back. And what if, he added softly, The real theft isn't what I did, but what they're trying to bury." The judge leaned forward slightly. The room had grown completely still. Even the hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. Keanu nodded respectfully toward the jury. "I trust you'll listen, not just to the loud voices, but to the quiet ones too." Then he returned to his seat, sat, opened his notebook again, and began to read. No applause, no murmurs, just silence. Judge Klein looked between the tables, then spoke. "Plaintiff may call its first witness." Langford stood, a small tremor of irritation in his fingers now. "The plaintiff calls Gregory Turner, lead patent counsel for Orontech." As the bailiff opened the side door and the witness approached, the cameras shifted. Reporters leaned forward again. But not all eyes were on the witness. Some were on Keanu, on the man with the notebook, the one who didn't flinch, the one who had just changed the entire temperature of the room without raising his voice. 3 weeks earlier, the morning light cut across the East LA skyline as Keanu Reeves parked his modest black motorcycle outside a crumbling brick building on Temple Street. The sign above the door read, "East Grid Collective, Community Tech Incubator." It was faded, and one of the letters was hanging by a single rusted screw. But inside, life pulsed with urgency. Children tinkered with circuit boards in one corner. A college dropout in a beanie was running load simulations on a cracked laptop, and in the back, under a dome of humming fluorescent lights, stood Darius Monroe, barely 30, with sleeves rolled up and grease on his forehead, punching calculations into a digital voltmeter. Keanu walked in, holding a box of pastries and 2 thermoses of coffee. Darius looked up and grinned. "You're early again," Keanu shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd bring carbs and caffeine." Darius chuckled and took the coffee. "You're ruining my rep with the interns. They already think you're some tech wizard in disguise." Keanu leaned over a whiteboard filled with equations and sketches. "Only in disguise," he said, pointing at one of the load balance equations. "You're still overcharging cell 6. "That's impossible," Darius muttered, checking the board again. "We rerouted the B-phase converter yesterday. Check the millisecond bleed-off between pulses. You're getting phantom surges." Darius paused, redoing the math in his head. His eyes widened. "You're right. Holy, I didn't even see it." Keanu smiled. "That's why I don't sleep." That morning, like dozens before it, had been quiet. Just 2 men in an old building, building something bigger than themselves. The microgrid project had been Darius's dream. Keanu had met him at a sustainability conference where Darius gave a short, nervous talk about decentralized energy and community resilience. No one stayed to talk after his session. Except Keanu. 2 days later, he wired $50,000 into East Grid's account and showed up with a notebook. They weren't trying to save the world, just one block of it. The design was simple but ambitious. Modular solar hubs that could be daisy-chained across rooftops, real-time failover detection, battery stacks made from recycled laptop cells. Keanu provided funding, feedback, and humility. Darius provided brilliance, but brilliance attracted attention. 2 weeks after they completed their first successful prototype, a recruiter from Orontech appeared. He brought pizza, charm, and an offer Darius couldn't ignore. "I don't trust them," Keanu had said, sitting with Darius that night after the recruiter left. "They build fast, but they forget why." "I know," Darius had replied. "But they have reach. If we want this to scale, we can't do it alone." Keanu didn't argue. He just handed Darius the notebook and said, "Don't let them turn this into just another commodity." Darius left the next morning. 3 weeks later, Orontech announced their revolutionary new microgrid technology. He called it Oron Solar Nexus EM. The announcement went viral within hours. Tech blogs declared it a game changer. Financial analysts called it the biggest green innovation since the lithium-ion boom. Orontech's stock price jumped 18% overnight. The media celebrated the company's bold leap into sustainable energy. But Keanu watched it all unfold with quiet disbelief. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was confused. Because the schematics they showed during the press release weren't just similar to the system he and Darius had built, they were identical, right down to the adaptive failsafe signature he'd personally designed with Darius at 2 a.m. during a citywide blackout. Orentech called it proprietary. Keanu called it theft. Within days, legal papers arrived, but not from Keanu, from Orentech. They accused him of breaching a non-disclosure agreement that had been hastily drawn up during Darius's transition. The claim was that Keanu had improperly retained access to confidential materials and was attempting to interfere with Orentech's rollout by asserting false ownership. It was a clever move. Hit first, hit hard, control the story. Within a week, Victor Langford appeared on national news. Slick, charming, and fluent in legal theater, Langford sat across from a primetime anchor and smiled like a man narrating a comedy. Look, I like Mr. Reeves, we all do. But let's not pretend a few handwritten notes and philosophical monologues make him Nikola Tesla. My client created this technology. Reeves was a silent donor, nothing more. The anchor laughed politely. So you're saying he's a naive actor playing engineer? Langford grinned. Exactly, he's playing a role, but this isn't a movie. This is intellectual property law, and the law doesn't care about charisma? Across the country, headlines ran with the quote, "Naive actor or secret engineer, the $600 million, 0 cents, question pundits. Debated whether Keanu had any business meddling in technical spaces. Some mocked him for thinking he could invent something real. Others defended him, pointing to his longtime fascination with design, sustainability, and ethical innovation. But Keanu said nothing. He didn't go on television. He didn't release a statement. He didn't call a press conference. He just quietly contacted a young legal associate he'd once helped get through night school. Her name was Olivia Tran. She had never tried a case of this scale. But Keanu didn't want a litigator with a brand. He wanted someone who still believed the law was about justice. He handed her the note, the same one he had used every day at the incubator. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes widening as she read through annotated diagrams, voltage tests, internal time-stamped memos, and systems theory overlays. You never published any of this? No, Keanu said quietly. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was meant to work. She closed the book, then looked up at him. They're going to come after you hard. Keanu nodded. Then let them. The lawsuit was filed in federal court, but the first hearing was set for the Los Angeles Superior Court right in Orentech's backyard. News vans lined the sidewalk 2 hours before Keanu arrived. Reporters huddled around the building's marble steps, waiting to catch a glimpse of him. Rumors swirled that he'd settled quietly, that he would no-show, or that he'd show up flanked by a high-painted legal team. Instead, he walked in alone. No entourage, no legal circus, just him and Olivia Tran, both dressed in dark gray, walking shoulder to shoulder through the crowd like two people headed to something much simpler than a trial, like they were showing up for a promise. Inside, the plaintiff's table looked like a corporate war zone. 3 junior lawyers, a digital presentation team, a paralegal with color-coded evidence boxes, and Langford at the center, smiling like the king of a castle he built himself. He didn't rise when Keanu entered. He just leaned toward his paralegal and whispered something that made her smirk. Olivia caught it. She didn't react. But Keanu saw her fingers curl slightly into fists before she stilled them on the table. He gently tapped the notebook once between them, and she exhaled. Langford finally stood when Judge Klein entered. He smoothed his tie and nodded to the jury like they were old friends. When the judge asked for opening statements, Langford gave the performance of his career. He painted Keanu as a well-meaning but misguided celebrity, a man who thought good intentions were equal to invention. He waived contracts, ridiculed schematics, and told the jury that Keanu had no more claim to the technology than someone who donates to a library could claim to have written the books. By the time he finished, several jurors were already nodding. The media took notes like they were witnessing a championship fight already won in the first round. Then, the judge turned to Keanu. He stood, walked slowly, held up his notebook, and didn't say a word for 10 full seconds. The room fell into a hush. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "Some truths don't need to shout." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't point fingers. He just told the jury what the project was meant to do, what it meant to the people who needed it, and how, if they truly wanted to know where the idea came from, they should follow the sketches, the handwritten voltage maps, the notes in the margins, the decisions no executive ever made but that two people sweating in a crumbling building had tested until they worked. When he sat down, Olivia whispered, "You just turned a lawsuit into a mirror." Keanu didn't look up. He just opened the notebook again. Let's see if they like their own reflection. Outside the courtroom, a reporter asked Langford if he was concerned about Keanu's statement. Langford scoffed and replied with a grin. It was cute. But this isn't about feelings, it's about facts. And the facts are on our side. He walked away laughing, but inside, for the first time in years, he had a knot in his stomach. The second morning of the trial opened with bright lights and louder cameras. Reporters lined the courtroom halls like it was opening night at a film premiere. A few even cracked jokes about how ironic it was Keanu Reeves, the stoic star of quiet roles, now standing center stage in a very public courtroom battle. Inside, Judge Klein called the court to order, and all eyes turned to Victor Langford. He stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit, then walked to the center of the courtroom with the smooth confidence of a man used to winning, especially when cameras were rolling. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice rich with sarcasm, "we're gathered here today not for justice, but for theater." A few jurors blinked, uncertain. Langford held up a glossy, full-color print of Keanu smiling next to a child holding a solar panel. "An actor," Langford continued, "who spent his life pretending to be a hero, has decided he is one." Olivia stiffened. Keanu didn't move. Langford turned, walking slowly before the jury like he was teaching a masterclass in performance. This case isn't about energy grids. It's not about innovation. It's about boundaries, between fantasy and reality, between playing a part and playing with millions of dollars in proprietary data. He raised his voice just enough to cut through the courtroom. "Mr. Reeves was a donor, a generous one, and we appreciate his enthusiasm. But you don't get to fund a soup kitchen and claim you invented the recipe." A few people chuckled. One juror smirked. Langford let the laughter linger. Then he held up a single sheet of paper. "This," he said with mock reverence, "is the original agreement signed by the East Grid Collective. It clearly states that all designs created at the incubator were collaborative property, to be transferred to Tech upon acquisition." He handed the paper to the bailiff for the jury to examine. "And here," Langford continued, pulling up a digital presentation on the screen, "we have a timeline showing that Mr. Reeves was not present for the final design phase, nor was he involved in the software integration. He had no GitHub commits, no signed blueprints, no author credit, just a notebook." The word dripped with condescension. Keanu, seated beside Olivia, didn't react. He turned a page in his notebook, slowly, and continued writing. Langford noticed and smirked. "Oh, he's writing again," he said aloud. "Maybe he'll publish a memoir next. How I Built a Billion-Dollar Grid with Good Vibes." Laughter broke out across the gallery. Even a few journalists chuckled behind their notepads. Olivia clenched her jaw, her hands trembling under the table. She looked at Keanu, whose expression remained unchanged. Langford walked toward the jury again. "This man is not an engineer. He's not a scientist. He's an actor. A good one, sure, but acting doesn't make you an expert, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to steal. He leaned closer to the jury. And that's what this is? Theft? Langford let the words settle in the air like a final chord. Then he turned to the judge and rested his case for the morning. "All rise," the bailiff said, signaling the recess. Reporters immediately rushed out, eager to broadcast Langford's latest theatrical swing. A few whispered, "That was brutal," while others nodded in admiration at how he controlled the courtroom with a single sentence. Olivia Tran gathered her notes quickly, but her hands still shook as she packed her folder. Keanu touched her elbow gently. "He wants you rattled," he said calmly. "Don't give it to him." She looked up at him, eyes filled with frustration. "He twisted everything. He made you look like a fraud." Keanu smiled faintly. "He's playing for the cameras. We're playing for the truth." She nodded, and together they stepped into the hallway as the jury was escorted out for their break. Outside the courtroom doors, Langford stood surrounded by microphones. "This isn't personal," he told the cameras. "This is about respecting boundaries. Mr. Reeves is a talented performer, but talent doesn't excuse overreach. When you touch proprietary systems, you step into a legal world where facts matter, not fame." Back inside, Keanu returned to his table, opened his notebook again, and turned to a specific page he'd bookmarked. Olivia leaned over. "What is that?" "A diagram," he said. "Not published, but dated, annotated, and signed a week before Orentech claims the final prototype existed." She scanned it quickly. It showed a new wiring matrix for energy storage management, nearly identical to the system currently at the heart of Orin Solar Nexus. Her eyes widened. "You sketched this?" "Together," Keanu said. "But I added this curve." He pointed to a change in the load rebalancing logic after Darius ran into thermal variance in the battery casing. "And you logged it." Keanu tapped the bottom of the page. A timestamp from a digital notebook sync, 2 days before the design's official version appeared in Orentech's documents. Olivia whispered, "This changes everything." "It only matters," Keanu replied, "if they're willing to look." Meanwhile, Langford returned to the courtroom with the smugness of a man already preparing his victory lap. He leaned toward one of his assistants. "We'll wrap this by Thursday, maybe even Wednesday if they don't call any real witnesses." He glanced over at Keanu, still scribbling in his notebook, and gave a little mocking wave. The courtroom filled again. The judge returned. The jury filed in, slightly more guarded than before. Judge Klein glanced over both tables. "Defense, you may now proceed." Olivia rose. Her heels clicked once on the wooden floor. "We call our first witness," she said clearly. Langford didn't flinch. He knew they had no one of weight on their side. But then she added, "Darius Monroe." The name rang out like a dropped gavel. Several heads turned. Langford froze mid-smirk. Keanu looked up for the first time that day, just as the back door opened, and Darius stepped inside. Darius Monroe entered the courtroom with hesitation in his stride, but fire behind his eyes. He wore a gray jacket over a t-shirt that said East Grid Bills, slightly faded from wear. The silence was thick as he made his way to the witness stand, and even the cameras seemed to pause in anticipation. Keanu didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply closed his notebook. Langford stood slowly, clearly caught off guard. He whispered something sharp to his junior counsel, who immediately began tapping furiously on her laptop. Judge Klein looked over his glasses. "Mr. Monroe, you've been subpoenaed by the defense. Are you prepared to testify?" "I am, Your Honor." Olivia approached the stand. "Mr. Monroe, can you confirm your professional relationship with my client, Mr. Reeves?" Darius took a breath. "Yes." Keanu funded the incubator, but more than that, he helped build the system. Hands-on, every day for 4 months. Langford stood abruptly. "Objection! This is anecdotal and unverified. There's no formal record of—" Judge Klein raised a hand. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Langford. Sit down." Olivia continued. "Mr. Monroe, do you recognize this schematic?" She handed him a photocopy of the notebook page Keanu had shown her. Darius stared at it for several long seconds. "Yes, that's our early prototype. That's my handwriting, and his." He pointed to the margins. "That curve there was his idea. We had overheating issues, and Keanu, was the one who figured out a workaround using adaptive pulse spacing." The courtroom rustled. "And do you recall when this drawing was made?" "About a week before Orentech approached me, before I ever signed anything with them." Langford stood again. "Objection. There's no digital signature linking this drawing to any recorded source." Keanu rose calmly. "Your Honor, I request permission to submit metadata from my notebook's digital backup, timestamped, geotagged, and synced to cloud storage." Langford's head turned so sharply it looked like he'd been slapped. Judge Klein nodded. "Submit it for review." The bailiff took the USB drive Keanu offered and passed it to the clerk. Within moments, the courtroom's monitor lit up. On screen appeared the exact same page, complete with timestamp. It read, "Created March 8, 7:42 p.m. Location, East Grid Collective." The jury leaned in. Langford muttered to his team, "Check if that data can be forged. I want a forensics expert." Olivia stepped forward again. "Mr. Monroe, did Orentech ever ask if this design was original to their team?" Darius shook his head. "No. They told me the design was theirs. I assumed they'd built from scratch." "And did you sign an exclusivity agreement with them before or after the prototype was finalized?" "After. Weeks after." Silence. Keanu remained seated, still calm, still grounded. Langford looked visibly shaken. Judge Klein tapped his pen against the bench. "I think we've heard enough for today." As the court recessed again, reporters flooded out with a new headline: "The notebook is real." And this time, no one was laughing. That night, Olivia Tran sat cross-legged on the floor of her apartment, the city humming low outside her window. The buzz of media coverage was already spiraling out of control. Her phone buzzed every 5 minutes with alerts, tweets, news flashes, blogs, headlines with Keanu's face under blazing captions like "actor" or "inventor," "The Courtroom Notebook," and "Reddit explodes over trial revelation." She should have been relieved Darius's testimony had shifted the case. The notebook had stunned the jury. Langford had looked rattled. But Olivia wasn't sleeping. The adrenaline had faded, and all that remained was fear. Not fear that they were wrong, but fear that the truth might still not be enough. Not against Orentech. Not against Langford. Not in a system that often rewarded spectacle over substance. She picked up Keanu's notebook again. He had left it on her desk without a word when they parted after court. Just placed it gently, like he knew she wouldn't be able to resist reading it. She ran her hand over the worn leather. It was heavier than she expected, thicker than a typical legal pad, and when she opened it, it wasn't what she'd imagined at all. She'd assumed it would be filled with thoughts, maybe reflections or quotes or meditative scribbles in his careful handwriting. But no, this was something else. The first page wasn't a journal entry, it was a technical schematic, not a sketch, a complete energy storage module breakdown. She flipped again. Voltage tolerances, real math, circuit diagrams annotated in multiple colors, dates, lab notes, an entire section on failure conditions, page after page. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't sentimental, it was methodical, logical, precise, and dated. All of it. She leaned in, her pulse quickened. Every diagram was logged, every change initialed, some by Keanu, some by Darius, some by 2 others she didn't recognize, likely engineers from East Grid. Olivia stood abruptly and began spreading the pages out across her floor. Cross-referencing timestamps, she began to trace the evolution of the solar microgrid system from its infancy to its full realization. She realized she wasn't just looking at sketches, she was looking at a living archive. The thing Langford claimed didn't exist. The thing the patent office had never seen. The thing Oron Tech had clearly stolen. This notebook wasn't a prop. It was a smoking gun. And Keanu had walked into court with it calmly, almost humbly, never once brandishing it like a weapon. Why hadn't he led with it? Why hadn't he shoved it in Langford's face? She stared down at the pages, the truth mapped out in front of her like veins in a body. Then she looked toward her window, where the city lights flickered in quiet judgment. Somewhere out there they were still mocking him, still calling him foolish, still whispering behind closed doors that the actor had stepped out of his lane. And yet, he hadn't said a word in his own defense. Only what was necessary. Only when it mattered. The next morning, Olivia arrived early at the courthouse, her arms full of photocopies and analysis charts she had prepared overnight. She hadn't slept, but adrenaline and disbelief were coursing through her like caffeine. Keanu was already there, sitting quietly in the empty courtroom, alone, writing again in the notebook. No press, no entourage, no coffee, just him and the pen. "You knew this was in there," she said, approaching him. He looked up slowly, setting the pen down. "I did. You let Langford humiliate you. You let the jury think you were scribbling poems while he tore you apart." Keanu offered a calm nod. They needed to see his confidence before they could question it. She stared at him, blinking. "You're playing chess while they're throwing punches." "I'm not playing anything," he said. "I'm building something." "Then let me help." Keanu gestured to the folder in her arms. "I believe you already are." They reviewed the timeline together. Page by page, they assembled a cross-record against Oron Tech's public filings. In nearly every instance, Keanu's notes predated Oron Tech's design claims, some by days, others by weeks, one by a full month. There were changes in battery insulation protocols, adjustments to energy retention under cloud coverage, even documentation about microcracks in the early prototype's photovoltaic panels. Details far too obscure to be coincidence. And the most damning entry of all, a post-it Keanu had tucked between two pages, dated and time-stamped, reading, "Darius says Oron Tech called him again. I told him to be careful. Something feels off." Olivia exhaled. "You tried to warn him before they made the offer." Keanu looked away. "I didn't want to believe it would come to this." "That's not just documentation," she said. "It's motive." They sat in silence for a moment, the courtroom still echoing with absence. Olivia broke it first. "Why didn't you submit this as part of discovery? This could have changed everything from the beginning." Keanu turned the notebook slowly in his hand. "Because I wanted to see who would lie when the truth was close enough to touch." Olivia sat back. "You were waiting, watching, not for revenge," he said softly. "For clarity." She studied his face, calm, unshaken. There was no smugness, no glee in cornering Oron Tech, just an unshakable peace that made her more nervous than any outburst ever could. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he closed the notebook, slid it into his satchel, and said, "We should let the evidence speak first. Then I'll speak last." Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. In a world addicted to shouting, Keanu Reeves had chosen silence as his opening argument. But when he spoke, when he finally stood, she knew the courtroom wouldn't forget it. That evening, Olivia returned to her apartment with the photocopies clutched under her arm. She sat at her desk again, surrounded by sticky notes, legal pads, and red markers. Tools of her trade, but her focus kept drifting back to the notebook. She opened it one more time. She wasn't looking for diagrams now. She was looking for something deeper. And she found it. Tucked in the back, written in a smaller, more personal hand, was a single page titled, "Assumptions We Forgot to Question." It wasn't technical. It wasn't legal. It was philosophical. Lines like, "What if justice isn't loud? What if integrity doesn't always win, but matters more when it loses. What if silence is the loudest objection? Olivia sat back, stunned. This wasn't just a man defending himself in court. This was a man who had built a case long before there ever was one. A man who expected betrayal not with cynicism, but with quiet preparation. And suddenly, she understood. Keanu hadn't withheld evidence out of arrogance or pride. He had done so because he knew the process had to expose itself. The media circus, Langford's theatrics, the public perception. They had to run their course. Only then would the truth land with full weight. She glanced over at her television. A late-night news segment was running. Langford stood in front of a gleaming marble lobby, smiling at reporters. "We're confident in our position," he was saying. "My client believes in protecting innovation. This isn't about celebrity or sympathy. It's about facts. Mr. Reeves is an interesting character, but this is a court of law." Olivia muted the volume. She could almost hear the smirk in his voice, but something about his eyes looked tighter now. The confidence still there, but the easy grin slightly more rehearsed. The man was too good not to feel the shift. She texted Keanu, "They're nervous, you can see it." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. One word: good. She exhaled and turned back to the notebook. The last page contained a list of names. Darius, Ramon Lee, Tanya. She recognized Darius. The others not yet, but it was clear they were part of the original team at the EastGrid Collective, people who had poured their sweat into the design before Orantech even blinked. It wasn't just his notebook. It was a record of a team, a community, a dream. He was never trying to prove himself. He was trying to honor what they built. And that's what Langford had underestimated. It wasn't about image. It was about truth. Olivia closed the notebook and stared out into the night sky. Tomorrow, the world would see something they hadn't expected from Keanu Reeves. Not rage, not performance, not even genius. They'd see quiet conviction, backed by proof. And finally, the whispers would begin to shift. The courtroom was more crowded than ever. By now, the trial had turned into daily news fodder. Journalists filled every bench, camera crews hovered outside, and social media buzzed with hashtags like Keanu Trial, Notebook Gate, and Langford v. Reeves. Langford strutted into the courtroom with a glossy confidence that fed off the cameras. He adjusted his tie like a game show host before stepping to the front of the courtroom with a dramatic pause. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to call Mr. Stephen Marrow, CEO of Orantech International, to the stand." The murmurs in the gallery quieted immediately. Stephen Marrow was exactly what people expected from a tech titan. Gray suit, silver hair, sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. He shook Langford's hand like they'd rehearsed it. Langford turned to the jury, smiling. "Mr. Marrow, can you please describe Mr. Reeves' involvement in the development of the microgrid technology now trademarked by Orantech?" Marrow leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth. "Keanu Reeves was never an official engineer on our team. He was a donor to a non-profit tech space that we later absorbed. We appreciate his passion for innovation, but the work was internal. Any suggestions he made were informal at best." Langford nodded solemnly. "Did Mr. Reeves attempt to gain credit for this technology after its success in the global rollout?" "Yes, he contacted us through a third party, implying he should be acknowledged. We found no legal basis for that request." "And you're saying he had no part in the proprietary version that was patented?" "Correct. We have full documentation from our lab team. No references to him, no collaboration logs. His name doesn't appear in our research or internal memos." Langford walked over to the evidence table and, with flair, held up a series of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I now present copies of signed non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, from every engineer involved in Oriontek's final design. These NDAs predate Mr. Reeves's alleged involvement and explicitly prohibit the sharing of design details outside corporate channels. He handed them to the court clerk, then turned back dramatically. Your Honor, I also submit financial records showing that Keanu Reeves donated funds to East Grid Collective, but held no board position, no employee status, no advisory role, and no retained technical consulting agreement. He had no contractual involvement. He was a sponsor, nothing more. The jury took notes. A few nodded. Langford returned to his seat like a man who had just delivered a closing argument. Keanu sat motionless, hands folded. Olivia leaned over. They're buying it. Every word. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small, folded note into Olivia's hand. She opened it discreetly. One word. Sequence. She looked at him, puzzled. What does that mean? She whispered. But Keanu was already opening his notebook again, not to speak, just to wait. And Olivia, still unsure what was coming, felt something shift. The defense wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Olivia stared at the note again. Sequence. The word floated in her mind like a riddle. It didn't seem legal. It wasn't a defense term. It felt more like a clue. Langford, meanwhile, was still basking in his own performance. He stood and addressed the court again. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to play a short internal video released by Oriontek, showcasing their engineers at work during the development of the microgrid project. This video was shared with investors and shows clearly the origin of the work in question. The judge nodded. Proceed. Langford walked to the display screen as the lights dimmed slightly. The video started. Upbeat music, the bright, modern shots of labs and 3D models. Engineers nodding to the camera, shaking hands. Narration played over the footage. In early 2022, Oriontek's pioneering clean energy division began designing the compact microgrid now powering emergency sites across the globe. Langford paused the video. There is no mention of Mr. Reeves, because he wasn't there. He turned toward the jury with practiced humility. We admire him as an actor, but this is a courtroom, not a movie set. And this, he gestured to the display, this is real innovation, real work, built by a real team. A few jurors nodded again. Olivia's throat tightened. She looked at Keanu. He wasn't reacting. He was still flipping pages, calm and detached. She looked back at the word sequence, and then it clicked. She opened her laptop and began typing furiously, accessing archived metadata from Oriontek's video. She ran a quick forensic scan, timestamp analysis, frame sequencing. And there it was. Buried deep inside the video's metadata was a string of creation timestamps. The footage was spliced. Scenes from multiple dates edited together out of order to create the illusion of a continuous timeline. A scene marked March 12 came before another labeled February 4. The narration was generic enough to mask it, but the code didn't lie. She turned to Keanu, breathless. You knew? He looked at her with that same quiet expression. I suspected. They faked the sequence to make it look like your contributions came after theirs. Now prove it, he said softly. She stood, heart pounding, and whispered to the bailiff. A sidebar was quickly called. She approached the judge with the evidence. Your Honor, defense requests to examine the video presented by the plaintiff under forensic review. We believe the sequence has been deliberately altered to mislead the jury regarding the timeline of invention. Langford's smile twitched. That's absurd, but the judge held up his hand. Counselor, you made this video part of your evidence. The court will permit the defense's request. We'll recess for 30 minutes while technical verification is conducted. Langford's expression was no longer casual. He looked at Olivia like she had just changed the game. And she had. Because now sequence wasn't just a word. It was the crack in Oriontek's perfect narrative. Court resumed just after noon. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters whispered to each other. Jurors sat straighter in their chairs. Langford tapped his pen in rapid beats that betrayed his usual cool. The judge looked up from the printed forensic report delivered by the court's digital evidence team. "This court has reviewed the metadata analysis provided during recess," he said. "It confirms that the video sequence presented by the plaintiff was edited out of chronological order. Several key design moments were rearranged to suggest a timeline inconsistent with the original file creation dates." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Langford stood immediately. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," the judge cut him off, firm. "This will be noted in the record and brought to the jury's attention during deliberation. The integrity of the evidence has been compromised." Olivia glanced sideways. For the first time, Langford looked shaken. Keanu closed his notebook, gently. He didn't smirk, didn't celebrate. He simply leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Would the defense like to proceed with cross-examination of Mr. Marrow?" the judge asked. Olivia rose. "Yes, Your Honor." She approached the stand with new clarity in her step. She knew what came next. "Mr. Marrow," she began, voice steady, "are you aware that the video your company provided was edited to misrepresent the timeline of events?" "I'm not directly involved in the editing process," he replied cautiously. "Our communications team handles investor materials." "But you approved this video before it went public?" "Yes, as part of our annual innovation showcase." "Are you stating under oath that you did not notice the sequence had been altered to place Tech's internal work ahead of contributions made by the East Grid Collective?" Marrow hesitated. Langford jumped up. "Objection. The defense is asserting facts not yet in evidence." "Sustained." "Rephrase," the judge said. Olivia took a breath. "Let me put it this way, Mr. Marrow. Do you dispute that Keanu Reeves' notebook contains designs that predate the earliest timestamps in your own lab records?" Marrow's lips tightened. "I can't verify that without reviewing his notes in full." "We'll be submitting them to the court tomorrow," Olivia said. "But let me ask you this. Did Tech ever reach out to Keanu Reeves requesting access to his designs, even unofficially?" "No," he said. "Not through an intermediary? Not through Mr. Darius Monroe?" Silence. The courtroom leaned in. "I can't speak to that," Marrow finally said. "No," Olivia said calmly, "but Mr. Reeves can." She turned and sat down. The judge dismissed the wetness. Langford looked like a man who had just been outmaneuvered on live television. When court adjourned for the day, reporters swarmed the steps. Keanu said nothing. Olivia stayed at his side, now understanding why he had waited, why he hadn't spoken too soon. Because some truths don't need to shout. They just need time to be heard. And the cracks in the empire had begun to show. The rain had returned to Los Angeles, soft and steady, tapping against the office window like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Olivia Tran sat alone in the small workspace she had set up in Keanu's home study. Files surrounded her, deposition drafts, scanned schematics, printed screenshots of video metadata. But none of it added up to the whole picture. Not yet. She stood and approached a modest wooden cabinet tucked against the wall. The drawers weren't locked, just labeled in neat handwriting. One caught her attention. Archive, Prelin Notes. She pulled it open slowly. Inside was a single external hard drive, matte black and lightly worn. Taped to the top was a label, written in ballpoint ink. SolarSeek, V1. Her fingers froze over the name. "Sequence," she whispered. She plugged it into her laptop, heart thudding. The drive whirred to life. Inside were folders, neatly dated. Nov_2021, Dec_2021, Jan_2022. Her breath caught. The earliest folder alone was enough to shift the weight of the trial. Inside it were dozens of schematics, hand-drawn and scanned, clearly marked with Keanu's initials and timestamps from over a year ago. She opened a video file labeled solargrid_talk_Darius MOV. The screen lit up with a familiar face, Darius Monroe, sitting beside Keanu at a small workbench. Both of them hunched over circuit boards and whiteboards filled with equations. Keanu's voice played through the speakers, calm and deliberate. If we link the fault-tolerant loop to the adaptive load cycle, the grid will self-correct during peak hours. It won't just store solar energy. It'll anticipate usage spikes before they happen. Darius nodded in the footage. You sure about the sequencing? Keanu laughed. That's the easy part. She scrubbed ahead. Darius was sketching a version of the microgrid's distribution hub, eerily similar to what Tech had later patented. But in the corner of the whiteboard behind him was the date. December 3, 2021. Nearly 5 months before Tech even claimed to be in development. She opened 3 more videos, more discussions, more collaborative sessions between Darius and Keanu. In each one, Keanu wasn't just a passive donor. He was an active, visionary contributor, breaking down complex engineering logic in his soft-spoken cadence. Olivia sat back, stunned. This wasn't a passion project. This was intellectual authorship. She pulled the drive out gently and wrapped it in a soft cloth, placing it in her bag. Then she walked upstairs to the sunlit hallway where Keanu stood, sipping tea by the window, notebook in one hand. She held up the drive. You knew I'd find it, she said. He looked at her and smiled. I knew you'd be ready to understand it. You could have won this trial on day 1 with this, he nodded. But truth, revealed too early, is mistaken for a trick. Olivia sat down across from him, the drive still in her hand. She stared at it for a long moment before setting it gently on the table between them. I've worked in law for years, she said. I've seen people lie, posture, manipulate evidence, even manufacture false narratives. But I've never seen anyone with proof this powerful choose not to use it. Keanu remained quiet, his eyes steady. Why? She asked again, her voice quieter this time. Why wait? He looked out the window before answering, because if I show them this too soon, they'll say I edited it, that I staged it with Darius, that I faked the timestamps or paid someone off. They're not looking for truth right now. They're looking to win, and if I give them this in the middle of the noise, it disappears into the spin. Olivia leaned forward. But we're running out of time. We're not, Keanu said gently. Langford thinks we are. That's his greatest mistake. He's playing to the clock. I'm playing to the current, she blinked. The current? The flow of perception, he explained. Right now it's against us. But perception turns when arrogance overreaches. He pushed too far with that doctored video. People are starting to question the story. That's when truth has weight, not as a weapon, as gravity. Olivia exhaled, half impressed, half exasperated. You think like an engineer, a philosopher, and a monk all at once. Keanu smiled. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. She laughed in spite of herself. So when do we use it? Not we, he said. You. Olivia stiffened. You'll introduce the archive, he continued. Under oath, with full forensic chain of custody. The jury trusts you now. You caught the video lie. You revealed the sequence. You showed restraint. That earns respect in their eyes. If I introduce it, it looks theatrical. If you do it, it looks undeniable. She nodded slowly. The responsibility felt heavier now, not just legally, but morally. You do realize, she said carefully, this drive not only proves your role in the invention, it proves Darius knowingly stole it. That changes everything. Criminal implications, corporate collapse, people's lives. I know, Keanu said. That's why we move carefully. This isn't about revenge, it's about repairing the breach. Olivia picked up the drive again. There's a part of me that still thinks this is crazy. It is, he said, and that's why it will work. She laughed again, but there was tension behind it. You're calm. I've already lost more important things, he said. This This is just a chance to build something honest again." She looked at him, realizing she wasn't just helping a client win a case. She was witnessing a man quietly change the rules of the game. Not by force, but by staying centered while the world tried to spin him off course. The drive in her hand didn't just contain data. It carried truth with patience. And tomorrow, it would finally be time. That night, Olivia stayed late at the office, long after the cleaning crew had gone home and the courthouse lights across the street had dimmed. She had the drive connected to a secure workstation. Every file was being mirrored to 2 separate backup systems, and she'd already arranged for digital forensics verification the next morning. She wasn't just preparing evidence, she was preparing to make history. As she watched the files finish duplicating, she opened one last video. It was labeled Personal Log, December 12. The screen flickered to life. Keanu sat alone in a quiet room, lit only by a desk lamp, his face partially in shadow. His voice was low, almost confessional. "I don't know if this will ever be seen. And maybe that's the point. You don't build something just to prove you built it. You build it because it needs to exist, because someone else will need it more than you ever will. That's why we keep going." There was no branding, no team, no pitch, just one man articulating his belief in the quiet utility of good work. She clicked pause, heart tight in her chest. She had always admired smart people, but this was something more. This was moral intelligence, the kind that didn't seek applause or victory, just alignment between what was right and what was real. She ejected the drive and slipped it into a protective case, then grabbed her coat and walked out into the chill night air. Her phone buzzed as she reached the curb. A text from Keanu. "You okay?" she typed back. "I've never been more sure of anything." The next morning they walked into the courtroom together. Langford and his team were already seated, smug and whispering. The Orantec execs wore polished smiles and sharp suits, oblivious to the shift that had already begun. Keanu carried nothing but his notebook. Olivia carried the truth. They sat. The judge entered, and as the gavel echoed across the courtroom, Olivia leaned forward and whispered to Keanu, "They don't know what's coming." He smiled faintly. "They never do." Across the aisle, Langford saw their exchange and offered one last cocky smirk, but something flickered behind his eyes. A hesitation. The kind that comes when your opponent stops reacting and simply waits. Because the tide was turning, and for the first time since the trial began, the jury wasn't just curious, they were leaning in. The courtroom was silent as Olivia Tran stood and requested to address the court. Langford looked up from his notes, momentarily caught off guard. He had assumed she'd continue playing a background role, calm, collected, supportive. But now she walked forward with a poise that made the entire jury shift forward in their seats. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "with permission, I would like to present new material evidence fully authenticated, time-stamped, and verified." The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a well-earned reputation for impartiality, studied Olivia for a moment. "Proceed." Olivia turned to the jury and tapped a button on the digital projector. The lights dimmed slightly. A schematic appeared on the screen, an elegant blueprint of an energy load-balancing algorithm, annotated in Keanu's handwriting. "This," Olivia said, "is the earliest known version of what would later become Orantec's solar wave grid controller. But unlike the one registered in their patent, this version is from November 2021. That's 5 months before the company claimed to have begun development." She clicked to the next slide, a folder of metadata pulled directly from the archive drive. She didn't need to speak. The timestamps spoke for themselves. Another click. Now a video. Keanu and Darius Monroe working side by side, discussing load cycles, sketching thermoregulation, laughing about unexpected results. "I remind the court," Olivier continued, "that this was never submitted as a formal patent because Mr. Reeves wasn't seeking profit. He donated the project to a nonprofit tech incubator. He was never paid. He asked for no credit. But what you're seeing here, she gestured to the screen, which now showed a side-by-side comparison of the two systems, is indisputable. This is where it began. Langford was already on his feet. Objection, Your Honor? Misdirection. These files weren't in the discovery packet. They're post-dated, possibly fabricated. We need a forensic review. They were verified by a certified third-party examiner this morning, Olivia responded smoothly. All of this has been submitted to the clerk's office with chain of custody documentation. The judge held up her hand. Mr. Langford, you'll have your turn to cross-examine. Let Ms. Tran finish. Langford sank back into his chair, fuming, but his smile was gone. Olivia returned to the jury. I understand this trial began with celebrity headlines and sharp sound bites, but what's at stake here is not personality, it's authorship, it's integrity. And it's the truth about where innovation comes from. She clicked one final slide. A photo of Keanu, Darius, and 3 teenage engineers from the tech incubator, taken before the scandal. They were standing in front of the first functioning microgrid prototype. Keanu wasn't in the center. He was off to the side, smiling faintly, arms crossed, letting the kids take the spotlight. This wasn't a solo invention, Olivia said. It was a shared vision, but its roots trace back to the man sitting right here, and that vision has been stolen. The judge nodded slightly. Does the defense wish to call a witness? Olivia's gaze didn't waver. Yes, Your Honor, we call Dr. Farah Idris to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Langford's jaw clenched. Dr. Idris entered with quiet confidence. Clad in a modest gray suit and rectangular glasses, she didn't carry flash, she carried weight. As a world-renowned systems engineer from MIT, she had advised governments on sustainable infrastructure and had no known connection to Keanu Reeves. Once sworn in, she adjusted the microphone. I was asked to review the material evidence submitted by the defense, she said. The schematics, simulation models, and design iterations all point to a unique system architecture. The style is consistent, the evolution of thought is logical, the timestamps are aligned, and the mathematics, she said, pausing, are beautiful. Langford shot up again. Objection? That's opinion. The judge raised an eyebrow. Dr. Idris, please rephrase. Of course, she replied. Objectively, the structure of this system reflects a consistent engineering philosophy. It favors distributed redundancy over centralized failover. That's rare. And it's significant because Orontech's published patent uses the exact same design language, right down to a unique load-balancing equation that I've never seen replicated outside this archive. Langford was visibly agitated now. He stood, pacing, shaking his head. Dr. Idris, have you ever met Mr. Reeves before this week? He asked during cross-examination. No. So your admiration isn't clouded by celebrity. I don't watch movies, she replied simply. I watch numbers. Polite laughter echoed around the room. Langford's smirk faltered. He pressed harder. You can't prove he wrote those equations. I can verify that they originated on systems linked to his name, his home IP address, and his nonprofit's internal server, she answered. I reviewed the logs myself. Langford snapped. This is grandstanding. Keanu finally looked up. His voice was calm, or maybe it's just the truth. The room went completely still. Langford froze, as if hit by something unexpected. Not the words themselves, but the stillness that followed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, it just was. The judge spoke next. Mr. Langford, control yourself. Langford sat, clenching his jaw, but something had shifted. The room no longer revolved around his theatrics. It had centered on something quieter, something firmer. The truth was no longer a theory. It had shape, texture, verification, and a human face. Dr. Idris stepped down from the stand. Olivia returned to her seat. The prosecution's team began shuffling papers, whispering among themselves, no longer certain where this was going. And Keanu, for the first time since the trial began, closed his notebook. Not because he was finished, because the momentum had changed. As court recessed for lunch, reporters buzzed outside like bees stirred from a nest. Headlines were already being drafted. MIT expert stuns court. Keanu's notebook might be real deal. Or Rontech caught off guard. But inside the defense room, Olivia didn't celebrate. She paced. "It's not over," she said. "They'll attack Dr. Idris's credibility. They'll claim chain of custody tampering. They'll say you orchestrated this for PR." Keanu sat quietly on the bench, a plastic cup of water untouched beside him. "Let them." "You're really not worried?" she asked. "I am," he replied. "But worry isn't the same as fear." He turned the notebook toward her again, flipping a few pages. "See this?" he said, pointing to a small drawing in the corner. It wasn't a diagram. It was a doodle. A child's face, smiling, labeled Ari, age 11. "She drew that the day the lights came on," he said. "They'd never had power before. That little station, that grid, lit up her village. It's not about courtrooms, it's about people." Olivia sat down slowly, heart heavy with something she hadn't expected. Pride. She whispered, "You could have burned them down with this weeks ago." "I didn't want to destroy anyone," Keanu said softly. "I just wanted the truth to breathe." Back in the courtroom, Langford returned with renewed energy, but his confidence had a desperate edge. He requested to recall Tech's lead systems architect. The man testified again that the grid model had been built in-house. "Did you personally write the load balancing algorithm?" "I oversaw its implementation," he answered. "But you didn't write it," Olivia interjected during cross. He hesitated. "No." She approached the bench with a printed copy of Keanu's early files. "Would you agree that this notation, right here, is unusual?" The architect studied it. "Yes." "Would you agree it matches the production algorithm now deployed by Tech?" "Yes." "And did you ever see this format before joining Tech?" "No." "Where did you learn it?" There was a pause. Then, "From Darius Monroe." And just like that, the circle began to close. Olivia turned to the jury. No further questions. Langford tried to object again, but the judge had grown tired of his games. "Mr. Langford," she warned, "you will have your opportunity to redirect, but grandstanding won't help you now." He sat back, breathing hard. "And Keanu?" He watched, quietly, hands folded, eyes steady, no theatrics, no vengeance, just patience. Because justice wasn't about crushing your enemies, it was about holding the line, even if your hands shook while doing it. When court adjourned that day, no one left quickly. The jury lingered in their seats. Reporters lingered at the back. And Langford lingered in disbelief. And in the center of it all, Keanu Reeves remained still. Not because he needed to be the center, but because truth had already taken its place. The next morning, court hadn't even resumed when the tremor hit. It wasn't from inside the courtroom. It came from outside, from the world watching. A breaking headline flashed across news networks and social media platforms simultaneously. Tech patent fast-tracked using shell entity tied to Langford's law firm. The article had been written by Clara Benning, a tenacious investigative journalist who had quietly sat in the back row of the courtroom for the past 3 days. Most people didn't recognize her. But Olivia did. She had seen Clara scribbling in her notepad during recesses, eyes darting between Keanu, Langford, and the jury. And now the piece was out. It wasn't just an expose. It was a bombshell. The report detailed how a shell company named Gallo Holdings, formed just 3 months before Tech's patent was filed, had funneled a 7-figure payment to a patent examiner's consulting foundation. That foundation was, in turn, connected to a golf club, owned in part by Langford's private investment trust. The implications were immediate and damning. Not only had Orantec potentially rushed through patent approval with questionable ethics, but Langford's firm appeared to have financially benefited from the maneuver behind the scenes. Inside the courtroom, phones buzzed quietly. Even jurors, instructed not to view outside coverage, couldn't help but glance at each other as murmurs rose like a tide. Langford entered the courtroom with his usual sharp posture, but this time something was different. His smirk was delayed. His eyes scanned the gallery, looking for something, maybe a sense of control, maybe just a reason not to panic. He found neither. By the time court was called to order, the atmosphere had shifted. The judge was already aware. "I'm aware of today's media coverage," she said. "If either party wishes to request a continuance or submit a motion related to this new information, the court will hear it at recess." Langford stood. "We reserve comment for now, Your Honor." He sat back down quickly. Olivia didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just placed a small, portable speaker on the edge of the defense table. "Your Honor," she said moments later, "with permission, I'd like to introduce corroborating audio recordings from the early design period of the disputed technology." The judge nodded. The courtroom dimmed slightly as the audio began to play. Keanu's voice, soft but animated, filled the room. "What if we built the redundancy into the node itself? So if one panel fails, the entire grid rebalances without human intervention." In the background, Darius Monroe's voice chimed in. "But that would require sequencing at the microcontroller level. That's actually genius." Another clip. Keanu again. "I'm not trying to change the world overnight. I just want these communities to have light, real light, power that doesn't vanish when the sun goes down." The jury sat in perfect stillness. No one coughed. No one shuffled. Not even Langford's team moved. They had expected a trial of legal loopholes, but they were getting something else entirely. Not a defense, a revelation. Olivia stepped forward slowly. "These recordings were recovered from a private archive maintained by Mr. Reeves. Each file is time-stamped and was independently verified by our forensic team. They demonstrate clear authorship, original intention, and collaboration. Months before Orantec filed its patent." Langford shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is inadmissible. These so-called recordings could have been manufactured, AI-generated even." The judge raised a hand calmly. "Mr. Langford, you may file a motion to suppress, but for now, the jury will hear them." Langford sat back down, jaw clenched. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. His voice, his real, unfiltered voice, had already echoed across the courtroom, not as a performance, not as a celebrity, but as an inventor, as someone who simply wanted to help. Another audio clip played. This one was different. It was a late-night meeting, the sound of coffee mugs clinking, a fan whirring in the background. Then Keanu's voice, hushed but firm. "They're going to come for this once it works. Someone always does, so we document everything, and we protect it, not for credit, but for the people who'll depend on it." Olivia paused the audio. She turned to the jury. "This wasn't a PR stunt. This wasn't a side hobby. This was a deliberate, documented act of engineering and public service. You've heard his voice. You've seen the diagrams. You've read the timestamps. The only thing left is the truth." One juror, a middle-aged man in a postal service uniform, wiped his eyes. Langford tried to recover. He flipped through papers, looking for some new line of attack, but his hands trembled slightly. His usual rhythm, confront, ridicule, overwhelm, was failing him. Outside the courthouse, the public had already begun to shift. Social media, once mocking Keanu's involvement, now buzzed with hashtags like "Keanu built it" and "Solar Justice." Memes of Langford labeled "Smirk Boy" began circulating, contrasting his arrogance with Keanu's calm silence. But inside the court, it wasn't noise driving the change. It was the weight of the evidence. the clarity of the audio, the integrity in Keanu's tone. At recess, the judge called both sides into chambers. Langford demanded a recess extension to investigate media interference. The judge denied it. "You're not on trial, Mr. Langford," she said, "but your client's conduct and the speed of that patent approval may soon become relevant. I advise you to tread carefully." Back in the courtroom, Olivia returned to her table. She glanced at Keanu. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her unspoken question. "Should we keep going?" She understood. Yes, because they weren't winning by destroying Langford. They were winning by revealing what had been there all along. As court resumed, a subtle change could be felt in the jury box. Before, they'd looked at Keanu as a celebrity defendant, maybe even a little naive. Now they looked at him differently, with curiosity, with respect, with something approaching belief. And Langford, for the first time in his career, had no idea how to smirk his way out of that. The courtroom was silent as Keanu Reeves stood up and approached the diagram screen. He had waited long enough. With measured calm, he tapped a button on the display, and the courtroom projector lit up with a dated schematic. Solar Seek, node flow draft, Jan 7. Then another. Substation fault recovery, Jan 15. Another followed. Thermal load map by region, Feb 2. Each one bore Keanu's name in the metadata, and each one was timestamped months before Orentech filed their patent. "I want to walk you through something," Keanu said quietly, looking at the jury. "Not to prove that I'm brilliant or right, but because someone isn't here to do it himself." He tapped the screen again. A video appeared. Darius Monroe, smiling. The footage showed him and Keanu seated in a small workshop, surrounded by wires, whiteboards, and coffee cups. Darius was mid-sentence. "So if we nest the inverter logic into the firmware itself, it becomes weather resilient without manual intervention." Keanu's voice replied, "And that makes it scalable without dependency on any centralized grid. No outages." The footage ended. The jury leaned forward. Keanu stepped to the side and brought up a simple timeline. It began in December, when he and Darius began collaborating on the SolarSeek project through the Community Tech Incubator. Then February, when the prototype was tested in a low-income neighborhood east of Echo Park. Then came March 3rd, a date circled in red. "That's when Darius received a job offer from Orentech," Keanu explained. "He turned it down." There were murmurs. "March 5th, he continued. "Darius was visited by two men he didn't recognize. They claimed to be venture scouts. He said they felt off." He looked over at Olivia, who opened a folder. "March 8th, Keanu said softly. "Darius died in a traffic accident. No substances in his system, no weather issues. Just a single car crash with no witnesses. Airbags failed. Dashcam wiped." He paused. "And on March 10th, Orentech filed the patent. With documents signed in Darius's name." The room exploded into whispered gasps. Even the judge leaned forward. Olivia stepped up. "Your Honor, we have obtained a forensic analysis of the signature. It was appended digitally 2 days after his death. The file was time-stamped at 2:17 a.m., traced to a secure server owned by Gallo Holdings." Langford stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You're accusing my client of forgery and conspiracy?" Keanu turned to him. "No," he said. "I'm accusing your client of theft and of burying the man who helped me build something beautiful." Langford's face flushed. The judge raised her gavel but didn't strike it. Instead, she looked down at the documents Olivia had handed to her. "This is a criminal matter," she said, voice tight. "This court is pausing proceedings effective immediately. Bailiffs will escort both parties to secure chambers. I am ordering an emergency inquiry and requesting the district attorney's office be notified." Gasps filled the room again. Langford sat frozen. Keanu closed his notebook. And for the first time in the entire trial, he allowed himself a small breath. Not victory, just relief. The courthouse buzzed like a shaken beehive. Reporters scrambled outside, phones rang, attorneys whispered furiously behind raised folders. But Keanu remained seated, hands folded, calm in the middle of chaos. Olivia leaned toward him. "I didn't know you had all of that." He met her eyes. Not all of it, just enough to start the real conversation. She stared at him for a second longer, then smiled. "You just cracked a billion-dollar wall." Behind them, Langford was pacing back and forth, the bravado drained from his posture. He barked into his phone, voice low and clipped, then slammed it down and muttered to no one. They weren't supposed to dig that deep. The judge returned after nearly an hour of chamber deliberation. Her face was pale but steady. "Let the record show," she began, "that based on newly submitted materials and preliminary verification by a forensic expert under emergency protocol, this court has serious reason to believe that tampering with intellectual property, fraud in document creation, and potential obstruction of justice may have occurred." Langford rose, trying to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is deeply premature. These are unfounded accusations based on theatrical presentations." The judge cut him off. "Mr. Langford, you will sit down or be held in contempt." He sat, slowly. She continued, "A temporary injunction has been issued against Orantech from monetizing or licensing the disputed technology until this is resolved." One of the jurors, an older woman in a librarian's sweater, covered her mouth with her hand, visibly shaken. Another leaned forward as if wanting to say something but holding back. The judge turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, do you have anything else you wish to add before we suspend for external review?" He stood, quiet as always, and took a breath. "Yes," he said. "Only this." He walked over to the evidence screen one more time, then he pulled up a different video. This one was short. It showed Darius Monroe in a sunlit room, scribbling on a whiteboard, laughing. "We could power half this block off surplus daylight," Darius said. "People think we're just tinkering. They'll see." Keanu looked at the jury. He believed in the people who couldn't afford to be believed in. That's all we were doing. That's all this was ever about. And then he sat down. No mic drop, no dramatic stare, just truth, delivered without ego. A long silence followed. Finally, the judge adjourned for the day. Outside, media crews swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones jabbed forward like bayonets. "Mr. Reeves, did you plan this all along? Are you accusing Orantech of murder? Is Langford going to be disbarred?" Keanu simply walked down the steps, with Olivia beside him. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In that moment, silence was louder than any headline. By the time he reached the curb, reporters had already changed their tone. From Keanu the naive actor to Keanu the architect. And somewhere, in the crowd of voices and flashing cameras, Olivia whispered, "We didn't just expose a case, we exposed a machine." Keanu looked up at the sky, the smog beginning to burn away in the late afternoon light. "No," he said softly, "we broke it." The next morning, the courtroom atmosphere had completely changed. Gone were the mocking glances and smug whispers. In their place sat unease, sharp and crackling, like air before a storm. Even the security officers stood a little straighter. Langford entered through a private side door, flanked by two junior attorneys. His face, once animated with charm, now looked gray. Jaw clenched, eyes darting, his steps lacked their usual swagger. The judge entered with visible gravity. She placed a thick folder on her bench, tapped it once, then looked directly at Langford. "This court has reviewed new forensic audit results from overnight examination of the materials submitted yesterday. The findings are deeply troubling." Langford stood slowly, palms down on the defense table. "I would caution against hasty interpretation of digital documents, Your Honor," he began, voice slick but thinner than before. "Metadata can be manipulated. Interns can misfile. The volume of material—" "Mr. Langford," the judge cut in, Are you asserting that your own legal team tampered with patent files and deleted relevant communications without your knowledge? Langford hesitated. I'm saying I cannot confirm the individual actions of every associate. So you're blaming your interns? A quiet snort of disbelief came from the gallery. Langford's jaw twitched. I'm saying the caseload was vast and I trusted. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. We subpoenaed server logs from Orontech's internal archive overnight. And guess what we found, Mr. Langford? She opened the folder and pulled out a printed image. 3 deleted emails from your direct account sent to Orontech's legal head. Subject lines, burial strategy, Darius M. Sequence files, purge priority, delay doc release, plausible gap. Langford's face drained of color. The judge continued. 2 of these were deleted after this trial had begun. That is obstruction of justice. And it doesn't end there. Keanu didn't move. He simply handed Olivia a small black flash drive. Olivia stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. She plugged it into the court's main display system. The judge gestured for her to proceed. I present, Olivia said calmly, a security camera recording from a private lounge at the Vista Legal Complex, dated 5 days before this trial began. The screen flickered to life. It showed Langford seated across from a man with a tight buzz cut. Orontech's lead compliance officer. Langford leaned in and whispered, but the mic was live. He just needs to say Keanu accessed the system. That's it. Doesn't matter if it's vague, you saw how these juries work. They want a story, give them one. The man looked uneasy. But he didn't access anything, Victor. Langford grinned in the recording. Then make him remember differently. The video ended. The courtroom was silent. Langford didn't speak. He didn't move. He couldn't. The judge took off her glasses slowly. Mr. Langford, in my 30 years on this bench, I have never witnessed such deliberate, orchestrated manipulation of the legal process for personal and corporate gain. You have violated your oath, your ethics, and the public trust. She turned to the court reporter. Let the record show, as of this moment, Victor Langford is referred to the State Bar of California for immediate disciplinary action. I am issuing an emergency disbarment request. Gasps echoed. Langford dropped into his chair like the strings had been cut from his spine. A hush settled over the courtroom like a final breath after a storm. For the first time since the trial began, Langford had no words. His reputation, once untouchable, was crumbling in real time. Reporters sat frozen, unsure whether to write or just watch. Even the judge paused before continuing. This trial, she said carefully, will now move forward under a new lens. The defense's misconduct has not only compromised the integrity of these proceedings, it has weaponized the system against an innocent man. She turned toward Keanu. Mr. Reeves, you may proceed with your countersuit if you so choose. Keanu didn't smile. He simply gave a respectful nod. Not for money, he said, his voice steady. Just for the record. Langford's junior attorneys, now visibly shaken, began packing up documents. One whispered, "He never told us any of that." Another muttered, "We're finished." But Langford wasn't done facing consequences. As the bailiff escorted him out under court order, a member of the gallery stood up. It was Dr. Farah Idris. I'd like to submit a formal ethics complaint against Mr. Langford to the MIT Public Science Consortium, she said. His tactics not only harmed Mr. Reeves, but also endangered the integrity of scientific collaboration and research funding. The judge nodded. Your submission will be accepted. A camera flash popped near the back of the room. The journalist who took it whispered into her phone. Headline just changed, from Keanu sued for fraud to Langford disbarred for fabrication. Push it now. Outside the courthouse, the press frenzy reignited, but this time the questions were different. Mr. Reeves, how long did you know Langford was hiding evidence? Will you seek damages for defamation? Did you really build the energy system yourself? Keanu paused before the microphones. "I didn't build it by myself," he said softly. "Darius Monroe was a genius. We just listened to the same questions and tried to answer them with light, not power." Then he walked away. Reporters turned to Olivia, but she simply smiled and said, "You saw the tapes. He doesn't need anyone to speak for him." Back in the courtroom, the jury sat stunned. Many had come in skeptical. Some had even rolled their eyes when Keanu chose to represent himself. Now they looked like people who had witnessed not a trial, but a revelation. The judge called for recess to allow for reorganization of legal teams and next steps. As the room emptied, Olivia sat down next to Keanu on the now cleared defense bench. "You could have crushed him days ago," she said. "Why wait?" Keanu stared ahead, eyes fixed on the seal of justice mounted on the wall. "Because when people are watching, they need to see more than victory," he replied. "They need to see what patience looks like, what it sounds like when truth takes its time." Olivia let the words hang between them. Then she looked at him and said, "You didn't just win this case. You changed the way people are going to think about these systems forever." He opened his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and scribbled one line. "Truth isn't a weapon. It's a light." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the courtroom behind, it was clear that something far bigger than a lawsuit had ended that day. Something corrupt had broken, and something deeply human had just begun. The courtroom had been silent for nearly an hour, but it felt like a century. Every seat was filled, yet no one moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The jury had been out for 2 days, and now, at last, they were filing back in. 12 people, each of them changed by what they had seen. The smirks were gone, the doubts erased. All that remained were solemn faces and steady eyes. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair and an air of quiet authority, stood with the verdict slip in hand. The judge, composed but clearly alert to the weight of the moment, addressed her gently. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "And how do you find in the matter of Reeves v. Orantec Incorporated?" The foreperson glanced at Keanu, then read aloud, "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Keanu Reeves, on all claims." A soft gasp echoed through the courtroom. But she wasn't finished. "In addition, we unanimously recommend that this court forward evidence for criminal investigation against Orantec Incorporated and Mr. Victor Langford for obstruction, witness tampering, and attempted fraud upon the court." The courtroom erupted. Some reporters leapt to their feet, trying to text and film at the same time. Several jurors wiped their eyes. One, an older man with a veteran's posture, simply saluted Keanu from his seat. Olivia's breath caught in her chest. For all the preparation, for all the nights poring over schematics and timestamps, she hadn't allowed herself to imagine this moment. Not really. Tears welled up. She blinked hard, but couldn't stop them. When she looked at Keanu, expecting relief or triumph, she found something else. Stillness. He sat motionless, his notebook closed before him. No smile, no fist pump, no victory speech, just silence. The judge called for order and thanked the jury for their service. As the jurors filed out, some offered nods toward the defense table. They weren't congratulating a celebrity. They were acknowledging a man who had trusted them with the truth and waited for them to see it. Outside the courtroom, chaos erupted. The media swarmed. Anchors raced to go live. Headlines updated in real time. Keanu Reeves wins stunning courtroom victory. Jury calls for criminal investigation into tech giant. Silence beat spin. Inside, the bailiff approached Olivia and handed her a formal copy of the verdict. Her hands trembled as she took it. She turned to Keanu. "We did it." But he just nodded and whispered, "You did more than win. You held the line." Then he picked up his notebook, gently opened it to a new page, and stared at the blank paper for a long moment. "What now?" Olivia asked softly. Keanu traced his fingers along the spine of the book. Now, he said, we begin again. She didn't ask what he meant, because in that moment she understood. This wasn't an ending. This was a reset, a chance to build a world where systems didn't get to crush people and where silence could speak louder than 1,000 lies. The judge remained seated for several moments after the jury had exited, as if allowing the gravity of what had just unfolded to settle over the courtroom like dust after a long storm. I will issue a formal statement by the end of the day, he finally said. Until then, Mr. Reeves, you are free to go. And Ms. Tran, your conduct has been exemplary. Olivia's eyes widened. She had never expected to be noticed by name. Thank you, Your Honor, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Keanu and Olivia gathered their things. But instead of heading for the nearest exit, Keanu walked to the back row, to an older man in a tweed jacket who had been sitting quietly through the entire trial. No press pass, no camera, just observation. Keanu extended his hand. The man rose and shook it. Thank you for showing up, Keanu said. The man nodded. I once built bridges, not systems, but the principle's the same. Truth is tension-tested. Outside, a reporter was shouting questions through the noise. Keanu, what would you say to the millions watching right now? Keanu didn't stop. He didn't turn. He simply walked beside Olivia, who shielded the notebook under her arm like it was something sacred. But as they stepped past the crowd and into the sunlight, he paused. Not for the cameras, for the moment. Dozens of people waited behind the barriers. Some held signs. Thank you for standing up. Truth matters. We believe you. One little boy held up a hand-drawn diagram of solar panels and batteries, mimicking the very system Keanu had designed. Keanu smiled for the first time that day. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen and signed the drawing. Not with a flourish, just a steady hand. Keep building, he told the boy. Then he turned to Olivia. They still think this was about me. She raised an eyebrow. Wasn't it? No, Keanu said. It was about what happens when you don't back down, even when they laugh, especially when they laugh. At the far end of the plaza, the former jurors had regrouped. They weren't taking selfies. They weren't giving interviews. They were just standing together, talking, smiling. One of them waved. Olivia waved back. That night, as the headlines rolled and networks scrambled to update the story, Keanu sat alone in his modest apartment. The notebook lay beside a cup of tea, untouched. The television was off. His phone buzzed with congratulations. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened the notebook to the final page. Then he flipped it back to the front page. Then he flipped it back to the front, to where the first sketch of SolarSeek had been drawn. Just a few lines, some arrows, and a question in the corner. What if energy belonged to everyone? He underlined the question with a slow, deliberate stroke. Then he turned to a fresh page and wrote 5 words. Truth doesn't roar. It waits. And he let the silence answer everything else. The morning after the verdict, Keanu Reeves arrived back in the courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a man everyone now watched differently. There were no taunts this time, no whispering jurors, no smirking attorneys, no mocking headlines flickering on courtroom monitors. Only the sound of chairs shifting and reporters adjusting their microphones as they waited for what would come next. The legal team from Orantech had returned, noticeably smaller and less confident. Langford was gone, disbarred in disgrace. In his place sat a corporate mediator, thin and pale, avoiding eye contact with everyone but the judge. The judge addressed the room. In light of yesterday's ruling, the matter of damages and remedy is now before us. He turned to Keanu. Mr. Reeves, you are entitled to significant financial restitution. Given the violation of intellectual property, attempted defamation, and the emotional distress caused by this case, the court recognizes your right to seek damages. The mediator from Orantech stood quickly, as if ready to salvage a sinking ship. Your Honor, Orentech is prepared to offer a full public apology, a cash settlement of $85 million, and a 5% equity stake in future solar grid sales. A few reporters gasped. The number was staggering, especially for someone who had never sought financial gain from the project in the first place. Olivia looked at Keanu, stunned. But Keanu didn't react. He didn't glance at the papers in front of him or whisper to Olivia. He simply rose, adjusted the sleeves of his suit, and stepped forward. No. The word cut through the courtroom like a blade. The judge blinked. I'm sorry. Keanu's voice remained calm, unwavering. I decline the settlement. I don't want their money. I don't want their shares. The mediator fumbled. Mr. Reeves, this is a life-changing offer. It already changed my life, Keanu interrupted. They took something meant to help people and turned it into a proprietary weapon. I don't want compensation. I want restoration. He turned slightly to face the gallery, where several members of the jury had returned, curious to witness the aftermath of the storm they had just weathered. I propose that the SolarSeek microgrid, in its entirety, be made open source and immediately released into the public domain. All blueprints, code, and system architecture, free for anyone to use, adapt, and improve, especially underserved communities. The mediator stared, dumbfounded. That's not how this works. Keanu smiled faintly. It should be. Murmurs broke out in the courtroom. A reporter in the back dropped their pen. Another started frantically typing. The judge leaned forward, studying Keanu closely. You're certain about this? Yes. You understand what you're giving up? Keanu nodded. That's the point. The judge took a long breath, then slowly nodded. This court accepts Mr. Reeves's proposal. The defendant will comply with the open source transition immediately. All future attempts to patent, trademark, or commercialize the SolarSeek system by Orentech or its affiliates will be considered violations of this ruling. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone in the gallery stood, then another, and another. Soon, the entire courtroom was on its feet, not in protest or disbelief, but in something rarely seen in legal chambers: silent admiration. Olivia stood up beside Keanu, her hands trembling slightly. You didn't even flinch, she whispered to him as the judge began drafting the formal ruling. You gave up everything they thought you wanted. Keanu turned to her, eyes calm. They only saw a price tag. I saw a purpose. The crowd's murmurs evolved into full-throated conversation as the media rushed to capture reactions. Reporters who had mocked Keanu days earlier were now scrambling to adjust their headlines. From fool to visionary, one screen blared. The quiet genius wins, another declared in bold type. Paparazzi lenses followed Keanu as he walked out of the courtroom, but this time, no one called out insults. They simply watched. Outside, microphones were shoved into his path, but Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. Olivia spoke for him, standing in front of the cameras with the same dignity she had watched Keanu carry through every brutal day of the trial. The truth was never about profit, she said. It was about people, and today, people won. That soundbite would be replayed across the world. Back in the courtroom, the judge handed a printed statement to the clerk. The courtroom stenographer read aloud the final ruling for the record. The technology known as SolarSeek is hereby released to public domain, to be protected from privatization and commercial restriction. Orentech is ordered to issue an immediate correction and retraction of all public statements made against Mr. Reeves. Furthermore, a criminal investigation into Orentech's patent acquisition practices is recommended. The Orentech representatives remained silent. They had nothing left to say. That night, Olivia and Keanu sat in a quiet corner of a small downtown diner, far away from press conferences and celebration parties. The only thing on the table was a pot of black coffee between them and a folded copy of the judge's ruling. Olivia stared at it, then finally asked, You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? Keanu looked down at his cup. Not everything, but I knew what I was willing to lose. But why not settle? Why not take the deal and walk away with millions? He finally met her eyes. Because sometimes when you win, the world stays the same. But when you give something away, it changes. Outside the window, a bus passed slowly. On its side, a new headline was already printed on digital display. Keanu Reeves declines $85 million 0-cent settlement. Gives technology to the world instead. Across social media, engineers, educators, and activists were already sharing the open-source files that had been uploaded an hour earlier. Community organizers in Kenya were planning test builds. Schools in South America were integrating the blueprints into science curriculum. A Navajo Nation chapter in Arizona announced they would pilot the microgrid as an energy solution for remote homes. The ripple was beginning. Olivia leaned back, watching Keanu as he pulled out his leather-bound notebook and opened to a fresh page. "What now?" she asked. He smiled gently. "Now we see who builds." The waitress came by and refilled their coffee. "You're that guy from the news, right?" she asked, squinting. Keanu looked up. "Sometimes." She smiled and walked off. There was no selfie, no questions about fame, just a quiet acknowledgement. That, too, felt like a victory. 2 weeks after the courtroom doors closed behind him, Keanu Reeves stood outside a modest brick home on the outskirts of Pasadena. He held a simple bouquet of white lilies in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. A quiet nervousness lingered behind his steady eyes. He wasn't here as a public figure. He was here as a friend of someone gone too soon. The door opened before he could knock. Camille Monroe looked older than her years, though her eyes held a calm strength. She wore a plain blue cardigan and held the door open with a tired but respectful nod. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said. "I did," Keanu replied, offering her the flowers. She stepped aside to let him in. The living room was small and lived in. Family photos covered the wall. Darius smiling beside a young girl, laughing at a science fair, and one photo of him and Keanu, arms around each other, both squinting into the sun outside the old tech incubator. Camille motioned for him to sit. "I watched every minute of the trial," she said softly. "I know what you did for him, for us." "I didn't do enough," Keanu replied. Camille gave him a long look. "You did more than anyone else ever has." From a drawer in a corner cabinet, she pulled out a worn leather notebook, much like Keanu's own. She handed it to him. "This was Darius's, his last entries. He told me if anything ever happened, I should give this to you." Keanu opened the cover slowly. The first few pages were dated weeks before the accident. The handwriting was rushed but familiar. One passage caught his eye. "Keanu thinks I'm the brains, but he's the one who sees the whole picture. I just build what he imagines. I don't mind. Not everyone gets to work with someone who dreams in blueprints." Further down, another note. "If anything happens to me, Camille and Naya need to be taken care of. Keanu would know what to do. I trust him." Keanu closed the journal, his hands steady, but his breath uneven. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet. Camille gave a small, bittersweet smile. "He never believed he was the smartest man in the room, but he believed in you, said you had more heart than any engineer he'd ever known." There was a pause between them, thick with memory. Then Keanu reached for the manila envelope and slid it across the table. "What's this?" she asked. He looked her in the eye. "A full scholarship for Naya, wherever she wants to study, plus a grant to start the Monroe Energy Fellowship, training young engineers from underserved communities, in Darius's name." Camille blinked fast, her composure wavering for the first time. You didn't have to." "I did," Keanu said simply. "Because he didn't just build circuits, he built futures. And it's time someone built one for his family." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the edge of a wind chime hanging on the porch. Inside the home, A silence settled. Peaceful, earned. Camille stood and walked to a small hallway shelf. She returned with a photo frame and handed it to Keanu. It was a picture of Darius and Keanu laughing mid-projection, wires and circuit boards strewn across the table. "I think he'd want you to have this," she said. Keanu studied it for a moment. "Then I'll hang it in the first Monroe hub we build." Later that week, Keanu sat in a conference room inside a modest building in south-central Los Angeles. It used to be an abandoned post office. Now it buzzed with quiet activity. Young students huddled over workstations, soldering boards, programming devices, sketching blueprints. The sign outside read Monroe Energy Hub, Phase 1. He stood at the edge of the room, observing. No press, no interviews, just energy, movement, and possibility. On the far wall was a mural in progress. Darius Monroe's face, painted in grayscale, surrounded by glowing sun motifs, wind turbines, and young hands holding tools. Olivia entered quietly and joined him, carrying a tablet. "We're full already," she whispered. 36 students. Applications pouring in." Keanu nodded. "It's a good problem to have?" Olivia hesitated. "Camille called me last night. Said Naya asked if she could visit the hub next week. She wants to build something that could help people." Keanu smiled. "Then we'll find her a bench." He moved to the front of the room where an old table had been set up as a podium. Students looked up, surprised. Some whispered, "That's him. That's the guy who won the case." But Keanu didn't mention the trial. He pointed to a faded blueprint on the wall. "This," he said, "was something Darius and I sketched at 3 a.m. over burnt coffee. We didn't know if it would work, but we believed it should." He paused. "And now it's in 12 homes. Families who had no power now have light, heat, connection, not because of politics, because of people, engineers, dreamers, like all of you." The room went quiet. "No one builds alone," he said softly. "I didn't, Darius didn't, and neither will you." He stepped back, no applause, just quiet understanding. Then the clicking of keyboards resumed. The hum of learning continued. Later that afternoon, Keanu stepped into a side office. On the wall was a framed letter from Camille, handwritten in ink. "Thank you for giving Darius's work the dignity it always deserved, for reminding the world that brilliance comes from garages and grief, not just boardrooms." He traced the words with his eyes, then pulled a fresh notebook from his bag. On the first page, he wrote a single line, "Dreamers need defenders." Then he closed the cover and looked out the window. Beyond the glass, kids were testing solar panels on the roof under a blazing California sun, and for the first time in weeks, Keanu breathed freely. This wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about legacy, about rebuilding what was broken, and about turning loss into light. The dry wind stirred loose dust along the dirt path as Keanu and Olivia stepped out of the battered Jeep. In front of them stood a small hillside village, tucked between sun-bleached fields and scattered trees. It had no paved roads, no cell towers. But now it had power, real power. Keanu shielded his eyes from the afternoon sun and looked up. Atop almost every modest roof, rows of small but efficient solar panels gleamed beneath the sky. Copper-colored wires stretched from house to house like the veins of a new organism, pulsing with silent, steady energy. Children, barefoot and wide-eyed, ran alongside the wires with kites made from newspaper scraps. Their laughter echoed through the hills, carried by the wind. Olivia stepped beside him, scanning the scene. "This is surreal," she said. "It's not a prototype anymore," Keanu murmured. "It's real, and it's alive." A man approached them, his face weathered but warm. "You must be Mr. Reeves," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Tomas. I help coordinate the hub here. Come, let me show you." They followed Tomas through the village as people peeked out from doorways, waving and nodding with shy smiles. Some children gathered at a small community building with solar batteries stacked against the back wall. Tomas led them to a one-room home with adobe walls and a rusted tin roof. Inside, a woman stood by a small refrigerator. A photo of her children was taped to the door. The fridge was humming softly. "For the first time," she said, smiling at them both, "I don't have to wake at 4 a.m. to cook everything before the food spoils. We have medicine for my daughter now that stays cold all night." She opened the fridge door and gently touched a vial of insulin. Then looked at Keanu, her voice soft. "Because of you?" He shook his head, humbled. "No," he said, "because of the truth." Tomas nodded solemnly. "The truth is, we've always had sunlight. We just needed someone to help us catch it." They continued walking through the village, visiting small workshops powered by microgrids, where young men repaired tools and women sewed clothing on humming electric machines. At each home, someone had a story. A child who could study past sunset, a grandmother whose fan eased the heat, a farmer who could store produce instead of watching it rot in the sun. Keanu listened more than he spoke. At one point, he paused by a bamboo pole where children had tacked a hand-drawn map of their village. Over each house with solar was a tiny yellow star, carefully cut from construction paper. Dozens of stars glowed on the map. Olivia stood beside him, her voice catching. "It's like a constellation," she whispered. Keanu nodded. A constellation made by hands that were never meant to go unseen. Then he crouched beside a little boy who was scribbling more stars on a page with a dull pencil. "You like to draw maps?" Keanu asked. The boy grinned and nodded. "This is my house," he said proudly, pointing. "And this is the house next. They just got power, too. I'm going to connect all of them." Keanu ruffled the boy's hair gently. "You're already an architect." Later that day, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the village. The microgrid lights began to flicker on, quiet, constant, and brilliant against the fading daylight. One by one, lanterns on porches glowed. Then strings of lights lit up around the village center, where families gathered for dinner beneath the open sky. Olivia sat on a wooden bench, watching children trace patterns in the dirt as their parents shared bowls of rice and lentils nearby. She had traveled the world for corporate law and watched more mergers than she could count, but she'd never seen anything like this. She turned toward Keanu, who was sitting near a low wall, notebook resting on his lap. "What are you writing?" she asked. He looked up. "Just recording the feeling. You forget too easily. Then one day someone asks why you did it, and all you remember is the noise, not the quiet that made it worth it." She sat beside him. "You know, people will write about this project. They'll call it a turning point, say it changed how we think about energy equity." He looked out at the lights. "Then I hope they spelled Darius's name right." There was a long pause between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Then Olivia spoke. "Camille called. Darius's daughter starts school next week. STEM program, full ride. She wanted to send you a thank you letter." Keanu nodded slowly. "Tell her to send it to the stars." Olivia tilted her head. "What?" He smiled faintly. "Darius used to say every breakthrough was a conversation with the universe. That when the world finally listened, the stars would blink back." She exhaled through her nose, emotional but composed. "Well, they're blinking now." Suddenly, a group of kids rushed past, dragging something large behind them. It was a makeshift banner, torn sheets sewn together, with the words, "Thank you, Keanu plus Olivia," scrawled in block letters. They held it up proudly as villagers clapped. One girl ran up and handed Olivia a bundle of flowers wrapped in brown paper. "For the light," she said shyly. Olivia knelt to hug her, overwhelmed. Keanu stood, taking in the scene as the wind lifted the banner and laughter filled the air. It wasn't recognition he felt, it was restoration. That quiet confirmation that something broken had not just been fixed, but transformed. A young woman with a notebook came forward hesitantly. "I'm from the local paper," she said. "Can I ask a question?" Keanu smiled. Only one? She laughed nervously. What do you want people to remember most about all this? He glanced at Olivia, then at the glowing homes behind them. That sometimes, he said, the most revolutionary thing isn't invention, it's permission. Permission to believe that people who've been ignored all their lives can be the ones who power the world. The woman's pen hovered in the air, her eyes wide. That's a quote. It's a beginning, he replied. As the stars came out overhead, the village began to buzz not with electricity, but with hope. The kind that doesn't just light up homes. It lights up futures. Months passed, and the media storm slowly gave way to silence. But it wasn't the silence of forgetfulness. It was the kind that follows a deep breath, the stillness before something new takes shape. Keanu was sitting at a window seat in a modest cafe in Pasadena when his phone buzzed. Olivia had forwarded him a formal letter, embossed with the seal of the California Bar Association. The subject line read, Advisory Role, Ethics and Innovation Oversight Committee. He read the message carefully. They were offering him a consulting position to advise on legal and ethical frameworks for emerging technology, a role of prestige, influence, the kind of position that could shape policy across the state and possibly beyond. But Keanu didn't reply. Instead, he folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He looked out the window and watched as two kids rode past on their bikes, the front wheels wobbling slightly from uneven sidewalks. A small dog barked nearby. The world kept moving. The next morning, he drove to Eastwood Trade School, tucked between a half-closed mechanic shop and a non-profit bakery. He parked beside a row of old sedans and walked inside, carrying a worn leather messenger bag over his shoulder. Inside, the classroom smelled faintly of solder, dry erase markers, and old textbooks. 20 students were seated at mismatched desks, some chipped, some carved with initials. There were no tablets or fancy digital screens, just whiteboards and rows of electrical parts spread across long tables. Keanu greeted them simply, "Morning, everyone," and began the day's lesson. They were working on modular battery arrays, simple power banks that could be deployed in remote areas. Keanu walked among the students slowly, answering questions, correcting wiring errors gently, asking more than he explained. At one table near the back, a young man named Javier sat hunched over a sketch pad. He wasn't drawing circuitry. He was sketching a system. Boxes, arrows, cycles, pressure thresholds. A language of ideas born not from a textbook, but from curiosity. Keanu paused beside him. "Tell me what you're building," he asked. Javier looked up, unsure. "It's not for class, just something I was thinking about. A cooling system for rooftop batteries in desert villages." Keanu pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "Then it's exactly for class." Javier's eyes widened. "You really think so?" Keanu nodded. "Your notebook is your beginning. Everything real starts with a sketch no one else understands." Javier smiled, a quiet, cautious kind of smile. At the end of class, Keanu collected the stray wires left on tables, stacked the reused instruction handouts, and erased the whiteboard. Outside, a few students waited to walk with him to the bus stop. They talked about life, not fame, about paying bills, fixing bikes, helping moms. No one asked for autographs. No one brought up courtrooms or headlines. And Keanu never brought it up either. What he shared with them wasn't legacy. It was time. He gave them the time no one else had. A week later, Keanu arrived early to class and found Javier already there, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by scavenged parts and a crumpled blueprint spread across the table. Wires, copper coils, and a small solar panel were rigged together in a half-built prototype. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Keanu asked, setting down his bag. Javier laughed softly, brushing metal shavings off his jeans. "Didn't want the idea to slip away. My uncle says when you get a good one, it's like holding smoke in your hands." Keanu smiled. "Then build the bottle." He stepped back, watching Javier troubleshoot a circuit. Few other students filtered in, pausing to look at the setup. There was no envy, just interest and a subtle spark of competition. Suddenly, Javier's passion was contagious. That day's lesson turned itself inside out. They adapted the curriculum on the spot. Keanu guided them through calculating voltage drop under sunlight variance. They debated airflow efficiency with barely functioning fans. At one point, a fuse popped and half the room went dark, followed by startled silence, then laughter. It was messy, imperfect, real. By the end of the week, other students brought their own ideas. Latrice began drafting a low-cost water filter using scavenged plastics. Rami built a crank-powered light for his grandmother, who still lived without stable electricity. The classroom transformed into something more than instruction. It became a workshop of relevance. A room full of young minds finally daring to believe they had something worth offering. One afternoon, after class had ended and the hallway had quieted, Olivia dropped by. She leaned in the doorway with a look of cautious approval as she watched Keanu help stack salvaged capacitors into milk crates. "So this is where you disappeared to," she said. He looked up. "You found me?" "I wasn't really looking. I figured you were healing. Or hiding. But this," she gestured at the room, "this looks like something better." Keanu wiped his hands on a cloth and walked over to her. "I didn't take the Bar Association offer." "I figured. You didn't even tell me about it. I read the letter, thought about it, but I don't want to be a symbol or a consultant. I want to be useful." Olivia crossed her arms, letting out a long breath. "You're more than useful, Keanu. You're necessary. These kids, they don't need to see a star. They need to see a man who stayed." He nodded slowly, eyes drifting to the cluttered tables. "They're making things I would have never dreamed of. They just needed someone to sit beside them, someone to say their crazy idea wasn't crazy." A long silence followed, warm and full of unspoken meaning. "I brought something," Olivia said at last, reaching into her bag. She handed him a small, wrapped package. "One of the students from your case sent this to my office, said she wanted to thank you, but didn't know how." Keanu unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a framed photo, grainy, black and white. A still from a courtroom sketch. In the foreground, a lawyer mid-argument. But in the background, faint yet unmistakable, was Keanu seated at the defendant's table. Calm, composed, head slightly bowed. He ran a thumb over the glass. "She drew it from memory," Olivia said. "Said that when everything in the courtroom felt chaotic, you were the only quiet thing that made sense." Keanu swallowed hard. "It doesn't feel like that when you're in it." "I know," Olivia said softly. "But sometimes the person in the middle of the storm ends up being the anchor for everyone else." The morning sky was still painted with the soft glow of early sunlight when Keanu arrived at the courthouse. It wasn't his trial this time. It wasn't anyone's. The steps were empty, quiet, washed in that golden light that made everything look gentler, even the hard gray stone. He sat down slowly, a simple black notebook in hand. It had no lock, no tabs, no digital assistant, just pages, some scribbled on, some blank, some filled with fragments of testimony he never got to say out loud. Others with quotes, sketches, reminders to check in on students or bring more batteries for the trade school. He opened it halfway through and stared at the unfinished page. One line underlined in pencil stared back at him. "Silence is not the absence of power." He tapped the page with the tip of his pen, thought for a long time, then wrote just below it, "Sometimes it's the source." The sound of camera shutters and hurried footsteps broke the stillness. A small group of reporters had noticed him from across the plaza. Only one approached directly, a young woman, maybe early 20s, holding a microphone like it was still unfamiliar in her hand. She wore no makeup, just a press badge and a look that said she hadn't yet learned to enjoy asking uncomfortable questions. She stopped a few feet away and gestured toward the notebook. "May I?" she asked. Keanu looked up, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "I won't quote you if you don't want me to," she added quickly. I've followed everything. What happened, what you did, what you didn't say, and now I guess I just want to know." She hesitated, then asked, "Was it worth it?" Keanu closed the notebook gently and set it on his lap. He looked at her, not past her, not around her, but right into her eyes. Truth always is. The answer wasn't defiant. It wasn't rehearsed. It landed softly, but with weight, like a stone placed gently into a riverbed, knowing it would stay. The reporter exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath the whole time. "Thank you," she said. She didn't ask for a follow-up, didn't dig deeper. She simply nodded and backed away, leaving him alone on the steps again. Keanu stayed a while longer, not waiting for anything, just being. He watched a janitor sweep the far edge of the plaza. A child ran through a fountain stream, his laughter echoing off the stone. Pigeons hovered in the air above the building, then scattered. When Keanu finally stood, he tucked the notebook into his coat pocket and looked at the courthouse one last time. Then his eyes shifted to the horizon. The light was getting stronger now, but it wasn't harsh. It was the kind that promised a new chapter. He took a few steps down the stone stairs, then paused. Behind him, the camera that one of the reporters had left running was still rolling. He turned back slightly, his expression calm but intentional. His voice was low, even. Sometimes silence is strategy. He waited. Sometimes it's strength. Then he walked away, not toward the crowd, not toward the attention, but toward the street, the morning, the ordinary, toward something smaller, quieter, and far more lasting. A few blocks from the courthouse, Keanu stopped at a small flower stand tucked between a laundromat and a news kiosk. The owner, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked braids and gardening gloves, gave him a quiet nod of recognition. She didn't mention the headlines or the trial, just handed him a single sunflower wrapped in craft paper. "For your classroom," she said. He thanked her and continued walking, weaving through the city with no entourage, no spotlight trailing him. Just a sunflower in one hand and the notebook in the other. The streets were starting to wake. Storefronts creaked open, coffee brewed behind foggy windows. Life, in its simplest rhythm, was moving forward. He arrived at the school just before the first bell. Students were already inside. Someone had drawn a stick figure on the whiteboard labeled Mr. K with comically spiky hair and a cape. Keanu smirked and erased it with his sleeve before setting the sunflower in an old ceramic mug on the front table. The day began without announcement. No speech, no ceremony, just learning. Later that afternoon, as students filed out and the room grew quiet, Keanu lingered behind. He sat at one of the old desks in the back, the one with a corner missing. The light slanted in through the windows, casting a golden hue across the scuffed linoleum floor. Javier stepped in unexpectedly, holding a printout. "I think I cracked the heat distribution formula," he said, eyes hopeful but cautious. Keanu scanned the equations. They were messy, raw, but there was something there. "You're closer than you think," Keanu replied. "Way closer than I was at your age." Javier nodded slowly. I want it to matter." "It already does," Keanu said. Javier stood there a moment longer, then asked, "How do you know when it's enough? What you did? What you chose?" Keanu leaned back in the creaky chair and looked toward the sunflower. "When you stop needing the world to know," he said softly. "That's when you know." Javier left the room in thoughtful silence. Keanu stayed behind, flipping through his notebook again. On the last page, in tiny print, he wrote one more line. "The most powerful thing I ever said, I didn't say out loud." The page stayed open for a moment before he closed the book and tucked it away. Outside, the sun had begun to lower. Orange spilled across the buildings, warm and unhurried. Keanu stepped out into it, letting the light hit his face. There were no reporters now, no cameras, just people passing by, living lives of their own. A little boy walking with his mother waved. Keanu waved back. The boy smiled, not because he knew who Keanu was, but because the gesture was kind. At the edge of the sidewalk, Keanu paused again and looked up. The courthouse stood far behind him. Ahead, only the long street and the setting sun. He adjusted the strap of his leather bag, took a breath, and walked forward. No grand music, no headlines, just footsteps and fading light. And for those watching, those who had followed the whole way, his story offered one quiet truth. Sometimes the most radical act is to stay silent and still be heard. Have you ever been underestimated because of your silence? Share your story in the comments below and tell us, what incredible story should Keanu take on next? We're listening.